Today is the 1st of March, the first day of our victorious spring, and Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum starts its operation. My name is Vasil Samakhvalov. We start our first briefing, and our guest is the Mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov. Good morning, Mr. Ivan. Good morning. Mr. Ivan, as to the situation in the city, Melitopol is one of the key cities for the Russians for the land corridor from Crimea to the temporarily occupied territories of Donbass. And they reinforced their measures for the fortification installations, constructions, and deterring Ukrainian counteroffensive. How the situation has changed within the last couple of days. We see that our guest has disappeared, maybe due to the air raid alert. We will reestablish the connection. Mr. Van, have you heard my question? I apologize, but no. My question is that Melitopol is the key city for the Russians to establish their land corridor to the territories of occupied Donbass from Crimea. So this is why they have special attention for defense of Melitopol, to concentrating of their forces in Melitopol and to constructing fortifications over there. How the situation has changed within the last couple of days. The situation changed to the worse for the civil population, and you mentioned it correctly that the Russians picked it as the administrative and logistic outpost, and they concentrate their material and personnel in there. Today in the morning, more than 50 items of material were moving along Melitopol in the direction of Zaporizhia and Zaporizhia section of the front line. At least in 2 locations, the enemy set up 2 training grounds where they train their mobilized. It's near the settlement of Mikhailivka and Molochny Liman. And they prepare the city for siege and defense, and we can judge it by the fact that they tried to set up 4 shelters based in our agrarian university, our Department of State Security Service, the Railway Culture House, and there is information from the locals that they built underground premises, digging the sea freight containers into the ground, thus establishing the shelters. And they try to increase the number of personnel and to build more fortifications in the city, but they will hardly make it because our armed forces have quite different plans, which are different from what the Russians tell in their propaganda. But this logistic corridor you mentioned is very important to them because they understand that the Crimean bridge may go out of operation at any second, and the main traffic to the occupied Crimea and occupied territories of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Kherson regions are going on through the main roads through Berdyansk, Melitopol, and from over there to temporarily occupied Crimea. The militarization of the city this way, how does it reflect on the conditions, on living conditions for the civil populations? Do people try to leave, or they have nowhere to live? What do the civilians do? Well, currently there is about 50 to 60,000 people left in the city, and the tendency to live in subsided because it's very difficult to leave the city, and only those who have nowhere to go and have many relatives in the occupied territories and specifically in Melitopol district, only those are mainly left. And the transition between the occupied territories is impossible too, because people have to get special permits, and the Russians imposed yet another phase, another wave of passportization lately, and the Russians declare that almost anything, almost nothing is possible without Russian passports, so the people cannot get any medical aid, any medical help. They cannot get permits for going from one city to another without Russian passport. And the same situation is with social payments, which were promised by the Russians. However, they don't pay them anyway since December, because they also declare that only those who have Russian passports may receive such financial aid. And the militarization is being reinforced by passportization and pressing on our civilians, so continuing with the living conditions of our civil population. What is going on with the price policy, for example, because the logistics ways for delivery of food and medicines is quite complicated, specifically from Crimea, and the logistics is complicated from the occupied territories as well. So how do people survive? What's going on with the prices? Yes, those regular products that we can buy in Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Kyiv, or Lviv are at least 5 times bigger. For example, a kilogram of meat may cost 500, 600 rubles or hryvnias, because the Russians equalized the exchange rate of hryvnia to ruble. And the range of products is quite narrow, which affects a lot the people who suffer from chronic diseases, and the medicines cost a lot anyway in the pharmacies. And the situation is being worsened by the fact of absence of any jobs, because more than 50% of the businesses don't work. So how do people survive is as follows. The government of Ukraine performs all their obligations in the occupied territories. For the citizens who do not collaborate, they are being paid special pensions, salaries, and social payments, to the including those who are employed by the businesses who are currently idle. And we understand that aid may be not enough. And when we talk about liberation of the occupied territories, we say that we have to liberate, first of all, our citizens who are left in temporary occupation. Please, questions on the floor. Irina Mamshur, Ukrinform. Good afternoon. I would like to continue with the subject of the civilians. Do you have any information about the number of civil hostages which we were able to liberate thanks to the latest prisoners exchange lately, or totally apart from those we know, like the mayor of Enerhodar Samoyduk? Do you have any information about the number of civil hostages that we were able to liberate thanks to the exchanges? And I will have another question later. Unfortunately, according to the information I have, the enemy doesn't want to exchange any civilians, though those are just single cases, like you mentioned, Samoyduk, Tami, and there are just separate cases when they give us away our civilians. The enemy tries to trade them, and they ask the relatives to pay money to let the civilians out of imprisonment. And unfortunately, the relatives, they try to succumb to those conditions, and the enemy sometimes, or even often, they circumvent those people, taking the money without letting people out. So we coordinate with the relatives of civil hostages which are currently in prisons. We have a relevant register, and Mr. Dmitro Lubinets, our Commissioner for Human Rights, he works with that register and stands for the interests of all the prisoners, including civilians. But unfortunately, the ball is at the enemy's field, and they don't want our civilians go. So within the year of temporary occupation, at least 1,000 locals were imprisoned, and half of them were imprisoned for a term from 2 days to 2 months. But there are cases when our people stay prisoners in Russia, all around continental Russia, and nothing is known about them. So you don't have any specific figure. We read about the 1,000 that they are in confinement cells in Russia. So as for what I understand, you don't have any specific statistics about them. So another question I wanted to ask is there any information, and is it possible to get any information about the Ukrainian school children? Do they have access to any remote education? Is it real? Is it possible? Yes, they have access to remote study. There are dozens of Melitopol school children who stay in the temporarily occupied territories, but they continue studying in Ukrainian schools, either for external study. Why it's not remote study? Because it's very difficult to study online being located in Melitopol. So children who stay in Melitopol, they just take the tasks from schools, and then they pass the exams for certain subjects with specific teachers from Ukraine. But it's very dangerous and it's very complicated, because we were given examples when, for example, during the searches, Russians were finding in parents' gadgets the links to the remote studies in Ukrainian, and the parents were taken to confinement cells, and once a mother with a child were deported from Priazovsky for this remote study in Ukrainian language. Yes, there are such children, but this kind of study is very dangerous and complicated again. Okay, another question is, do you know of any activity of Russians related to the elections in Russia? You mentioned that in Balitsky there were some deputies who were supposed to be responsible for that. So are there any movements in Melitopol in this regards? And if so, what are they? Is it reinforcement of this passportization that you mentioned, and how does it reflect on our civilians, on the inhabitants of Melitopol? Yes, we see a tendency to the beginning of the preparation to the elections. You mentioned it right, that there was a deputy coming from Sevastopol who was a deputy of our temporarily occupied Sevastopol mayor, and he got the task for preparation to the elections. And one of the collaborationists, Galina Katushenko, was elected as the head of elections committee in temporarily occupied Melitopol district. Also, in the territory of temporarily occupied Zaporizhia region, there are representatives of so-called opposition parties of Russia, like LDPR and Russia United, and they perform some propaganda actions in preparation to the elections, which clearly indicates that they want to perform the elections campaign over there in occupied territories. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Ivan. I'm reminding you, joining us was Ivan Fedorov, Mayor of Melitopol. Our next briefing is at 12:30. Joining us online will be Vasil Furman, Deputy Chairman of National Bank of Ukraine, and we will be talking about the exchange rate. Thanks. See you.